Anyway, without any further ado, I want to introduce Sophie, but I want to tell you a little bit about her first, and then we'll bring her on. She is the author of Feather Trails, A Journey of Discovery Among Endangered Birds. And it's about her experiences introducing endangered peregrine falcons, Hawaiian crows, and California condors to the wild. So while most of us see these birds, at a distance, especially the condors, she's actually been, you'll see images of her handling these birds as they're going to be released into the wild. It's really fantastic stuff. So she's an award-winning author, environmental writer, and wildlife biologist whose work has included the study and conservation of more than a dozen bird species in the Americas. She's contributed to reintroduction efforts for several endangered birds and served as the field manager for the California Condor Recovery Program in Arizona for 4 years. Her books include Condors in Canyon County, which won the 2007 National Outdoor Book Award for Nature and the Environment. And she's written articles for Bird Watching, Wyoming Wildlife, and Sojourns magazines. Sophie's writings are also available on her website, and I'm sure she'll flash that website URL soon, and her Words for Birds Substack. So very excited to have her with us tonight. And Sophie, I'm so glad you made some time in your day, despite the snow and and the questionable bandwidth in Wyoming.
Right.
But anyway, welcome. So glad to hear from you. And so let's have you take it away.
Okay, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you, all of you. It sounds like quite a crowd for joining me tonight. Thank you for this opportunity to speak to you about my new book, Feather Trails, A Journey of Discovery Among Endangered Birds. I thought that I was going to be worried about the sun in my eyes this time of day in Montana. It's usually sunset, and I worried about that all week, and instead it's snowing very hard here. So I had not expected that. Hopefully it won't create Zoom problems. But Feather Trails is a story about my journey into the amazing world of birds. It's in part a personal story about becoming and being a wildlife biologist. The book takes you behind the scenes and shows you what it's like to reintroduce captive raised birds to the wild in order to save endangered species. And in the process, the book illuminates the threats that imperil these and other birds. In the early 1900s, miners began taking canaries down into the coal mines because the birds were highly sensitive to toxic gases like carbon monoxide. And if the birds keeled over, it was the sign to the miners that the air was bad and they should exit the mine immediately. Today, our wild birds are the canaries in the coal mine that alert us to environmental harms through their declining populations or their failure to thrive. Because birds are so visible and vocal, it's relatively easy for us to monitor them and determine if their populations are declining or doing well. And when birds are disappearing, it behooves us to figure out why, since other organisms are likely being harmed too. When we work to resolve a problem or a threat that's been harming birds, we often help other organisms that have been negatively affected too, including us. The peregrine falcon is a top avian predator that's found on every continent except Antarctica. It occurs in a wide variety of open habitats, from the Arctic tundra to mountain and desert canyons, from coastal cliffs to our biggest cities like Los Angeles and New York. Today, peregrines are typically found wherever there are suitable nest sites, which consist of high ledges on cliffs, buildings, or structures like bridges. But years ago, beginning in the 1950s, peregrines began disappearing at an alarming rate. Their disappearance was first confirmed by a British biologist named Derek Ratcliffe, who completed peregrine surveys in England in 1962. He discovered abandoned peregrine territories and broken eggs in peregrine nests, which was something no one had seen before. And he realized that peregrines weren't successfully raising young. After hearing about the dramatic declines of peregrines in Britain, a US biologist named Joe Hickey, who had been a student of Aldo Leopold's and who wrote the first ever guide to birdwatching, which is certainly of interest to all of us, I think. He launched a peregrine survey in the eastern US in 1964. During that summer, biologists checked virtually every known peregrine territory east of the Mississippi, from Alabama up to Nova Scotia, and they didn't find a single peregrine. The eastern peregrine falcon had completely disappeared. A follow-up conference in Madison, Wisconsin in 1965 brought together scientists, falconers, and naturalists from around the world. Peregrine declines were reported from 36 countries on 5 continents, and biologists were soon calling the collapse of peregrine populations an ecological disaster. At the conference, several British scientists presented preliminary evidence that pesticides might be involved in peregrine declines. A new pesticide known as DDT had been used very successfully in World War II to control insect-borne diseases, and it had come into widespread use after the war to combat agricultural and insect pests. The British scientists showed that peregrines had disappeared from the same areas where DDT and other toxic pesticides were being heavily used. And this was obviously fairly tenuous evidence, but it inspired many Madison conference attendees to go on to study the effects of pesticides on peregrines. Other attendees were eager to try to breed peregrines in captivity, something that had never been done before, either for peregrines or any other endangered birds at the time. And if captive breeding worked, they hoped to reintroduce peregrines to the wild in places where pesticide use was less prevalent. These two pieces, research and policy work on DDT and captive breeding and reintroduction, ultimately became the 2 prongs of what became a massive conservation effort to save the peregrine falcon. Captive breeding was eventually successful, and peregrine reintroductions began in 1974 in the eastern US. By the time I headed to Wyoming in 1991 for my first summer of fieldwork as a biologist, releasing peregrines to the wild, the falcon had been successfully reintroduced in the east, and reintroductions were ramping up in the west. I'd only camped a few times when my field partner and I found ourselves living out of a tent on a ranch in grizzly country outside of Cody, Wyoming. We spent our first week of work monitoring and feeding 5 captive reared falcons that had been driven to our release site at the age of 5 weeks and placed in a large plywood box known as a hack box. We had 3 males and 2 females, and the females, as with all peregrines and many other birds of prey, were larger than the males. Each bird wore a differently colored leg band so we could identify them. I, being a young scientist at the time, wanted to be objective and name the birds after their color bands, but my field partner overruled me and named them after Egyptian gods and mythological figures. So when I read a passage in a few moments, you'll know not to blame me for the names, but the names ended up fitting really well. The hack box was anchored to the top of a small set of cliffs about a 25-minute hike from our camp. Before releasing our birds, we scattered quail on top of the cliff and hack box to encourage the falcons to stay nearby and feed once they were released. And on release day, our supervisor removed the front of the box so that the birds could fly free. In these type of reintroductions, the first 24 hours are critical and a lot can go wrong. For example, a peregrine in Washington State flew out of the hack box, got carried aloft on a thermal, and was never seen again. We also had to worry about predators like golden eagles and great horned owls, and even adult peregrines, which could target our inexperienced young falcons as they took their first flights. Hack site attendants like me were on hand to keep track of the newly released birds, to haze away predators with noisemakers, and to feed the young falcons in the days to come. Our peregrines all left the box within the first hour or so, and luckily they all stayed nearby. Unfortunately, though, during an afternoon thunderstorm, a side door on the hack box blew shut with a bang, which scared the birds, and they flushed into a violent wind and scattered. All but one eventually made it back to the release site, or the vicinity of the hack box by that first night, but you'll have to read the book to find out if our missing peregrine ever returned. We scattered dead quail on the cliff top each day so that our birds would have plenty of food. And we watched over the young peregrines from dawn to dusk. Over time, we really began to see their personalities emerge. The greatest joy of the whole summer was watching these young peregrines learn to fly. We documented their hesitant first flights and their wobbly landings, and we watched them as they mastered their wings and learned how to use the wind. Most incredible was watching the falcons engage in aerial chases and mock battles with each other. So I'll just read an excerpt from the book about what seeing these young peregrines flying was like. This is the longest passage I'll read. It's a 4-minute passage. It's 2 pages. The birds also spent more time soaring on updrafts of air, joining other raptors and tracing effortless circular paths on these invisible sky elevators. Most entertaining for us, our peregrines began fine-tuning their flight skills and developing their nascent predatory tendencies with endless pursuits and mock battles. Just as playing kittens developed the agility and strength to catch fleet and elusive prey, so too did the falcons' tireless aerial games fine-tune their bodies to respond to the evasive flights of the shorebirds, songbirds, and waterfowl that evolved over the eons to dodge the speed-made predators that hunted them. Though the wild chases had a playful air, these flights, this practice, would determine whether our peregrines became successful hunters and survivors, or whether they went hungry and perished. Evenings and mornings were now filled with the falcon's screams and aerial exploits, as one bird streamed after another like a small fighter plane locked onto a fast-moving target. The pursued bird dodged and rolled, tucked its wings, and fell earthward in ever more sophisticated evasive maneuvers. Becoming one with the sky, the peregrines flew with ineffable grace, dazzling speed, and breathtaking agility. As I watched their transcendent flights, I felt my own heart quicken. Transported by the falcon's inimitable aerial prowess, I could almost feel the wind stream behind me, feel every subtle movement of wing or tail that determined my trajectory, my speed, my effortless engagement with the wind. All the while, earthbound, I dispassionately scribbled my field notes, recording our falcon's flights, while never taking my eyes off the birds as they traced invisible loops across the firmament, imprinting their movements, their exuberance, their vitality forever in my mind's eye, and lifting my spirits in ways that only such epiphanic sights in nature can. Small wonder that legendary raptor expert Leslie Brown called the unmatched and unmatchable peregrine the prince of all flying birds. Now Ra launched from the cliff top, and with strong wing beats chased after Isis, who had glided over him, trailing an invisible weight that seemed to pull the young male into motion. Climbing above her, he screamed a challenge, then drew in his wings and dropped toward her at a steep angle. Cacking in protest, Isis tucked a wing, fell away sideways, and rolled over, presenting her ferocious talons. Undaunted, Ra extended his legs and grabbed Isis's talons in his own. Briefly, the two cartwheeled through the sky, their screams echoing off the cliffs and ricocheting over the valley. Seconds later, they released each other, and Isis circled over the cliff before extending her wings, flaring her tail, and landing with an almost imperceptible wobble. And then another tiercel, that's a young male, materialized out of the clouds, and the pursuer became the pursued. Drawing his wings close to his body, Osiris dropped toward Ra with breathtaking speed and agility, and an agility that the larger-bodied, proportionately shorter-winged Isis could never match. Undaunted, Ra dropped to his side, cacking fiercely as Osiris shot harmlessly past him. Leveling out, Ra flapped his wings, found an updraft, and shot skyward. Circling briefly, he dived at Osiris, and the two sped like nanojets out of view behind the cliffs. Ever watchful and attuned to the world around him, Gawain tilted his head to the right, then left, keeping a close eye on Ra and Osiris's antics from the cliff top, as Isis preened assiduously beside him. His large eyes seemed to take in the entirety of the heavens, and he watched his fellow tiercels long after I had lost them from view. Although the open skies were now a significant component of our falcon's world, our view of the birds was all too often blocked by cliffs, rocks, trees, and hills. But even when I could no longer see our falcons, the trails that they had blazed across the sky still lingered in my mind, and the peregrine's surreal speed and arresting acrobatics, even at this young age, left me awed. Oh, that was a picture that was supposed to be on while you guys were listening. So sorry about that. I always forget to get onto that picture. But our summer had plenty of adventures, including one of our birds being attacked by a golden eagle. But about 5 weeks after their release, the falcons began to disperse as they learned to hunt for themselves. And by 6 weeks post-release, we rarely saw them. After they had reached independence, they spent a few more months learning how to hunt before embarking on their first migration. Our juvenile Rocky Mountain peregrines were likely to spend their first winter in Mexico, and meanwhile, many of the northernmost tundra breeding peregrines leapfrog over wintering Rocky Mountain peregrines and fly as far as southern Argentina or Chile for the austral summer. About half of juvenile peregrines survive their first year. Radio tracking studies have shown that some falcons are lost to predation, others might die in collisions with cars, buildings, and power lines, and some die in storms or are lost at sea. I could only hope that my peregrines were successful. My time working with them was far too short, but it was really a life-transforming experience that inspired me to dedicate my career to helping birds. Over time, peregrine reintroductions like mine, which occurred all over North America, were wildly successful. Nearly 7,000 peregrines were reintroduced to the wild in the US and Canada, and the falcons began to recolonize their former nesting territories. But what really allowed the peregrine falcon to recover was the banning of DDT in 1972. As a top predator, peregrines killed shorebirds, waterfowl, and songbirds that had fed on invertebrates and vegetation or seeds that were contaminated by DDT. And by consuming lots of these birds over time, peregrines accumulated large amounts of DDE, which is a breakdown product of DDT, in their bodies. And this affected their calcium production, which made the birds lay thin-shelled eggs. Parrot and peregrines inadvertently crushed their eggs while incubating them, so they couldn't successfully raise any young, which ultimately led to the massive population declines. It took many years of dying birds, scientific studies, environmental advocacy, lawsuits, and public hearings before DDT was finally banned. But rather than learn from the lessons that peregrines and other birds taught us, today we're experiencing a similar type of environmental catastrophe with a new class of pesticides known as neonicotinoids. Neonics are less acutely toxic to vertebrates than DDT was, but they're far, far more toxic to insects, and their widespread use has contributed to what many have dubbed an insect apocalypse. We're currently experiencing an ecologically catastrophic disappearance of insects. Neonics are known as systemic insecticides, meaning they're taken up by the roots, stems, leaves, fruits, and flowers of plants. So insects that feed on any part of the plant either die or are debilitated. Neonics are highly soluble in water, so they're transported by runoff from terrestrial to aquatic environments where they can contaminate surface or groundwater. These pesticides are widely used in agriculture. Seeds of more than 140 crops are coated with neonics before being planted. And a single corn seed treated with imidacloprid, which is the oldest and most widely used of the neonics, can kill a seed-eating bird the size of a blue jay. Daily consumption of 1/10 of a treated seed during the breeding season can disrupt a songbird's ability to reproduce. More than anything, though, it's the disappearance of insects on which so many birds feed that's the biggest cause for alarm. Over time, neonics have had a tremendous impact on our ecosystems. Neonics are toxic to the earthworms and organisms in our soils, to the aquatic invertebrates that feed our fish, to the bees and butterflies that pollinate our plants, and to the insects that sustain our birds and bats. So unfortunately, despite the dramatic lessons of the DDT era, we're once again overusing a class of persistent pesticides whose impacts are widespread but still poorly understood. The European Union banned some uses of neonics in 2018. Here in the US, though, we've been slower to tackle this problem, but some towns and even some states are starting to ban or curtail their use. But to end my peregrine discussion on a happy note, which fortunately I can, peregrines are doing well for now. The fastest bird in the world was removed from the U.S. endangered species list in 1999, and there are now about 3,000 peregrine falcon pairs in North America. So this has been a real conservation success story. Things, unfortunately, have not gone as well for the second species that I write about, which is the Hawaiian crow, or alala, as it's also known. That's its Hawaiian name. And I'll use these names interchangeably. Most people are astonished that any crow anywhere is critically endangered. Most of us know crows to be opportunistic and able to cope well with people and their habitat modifications. But forest living crows that live on islands are completely dependent on their forested habitat, and they're some of our most endangered birds. The Hawaiian crow is the most endangered corvid in the world. Corvids are members of the crow, raven, jay, and nutcracker family. Despite its name, the Hawaiian crow is actually more closely related to our common raven than to the American crow. It occurs only on the island of Hawaii, and which is also known as the Big Island, where it resides in the cloud forest. A good portion of the alala's forest habitat in Hawaii was destroyed by Polynesian and European colonizers, and in more recent times, the crows were heavily persecuted. Their numbers were also impacted by introduced predators and diseases. Hawaiian birds evolved on islands that had no mammals other than bats and no reptilian predators. Their only native predator was the Hawaiian hawk, or io, as it's known in Hawaii. But people introduced rats and mongooses and domestic cats, all of which prey on Hawaiian birds that never evolved to cope with predators. Tree-dwelling rats consume eggs and nestlings. And if Hawaiian crow nestlings evaded rats and successfully fledged, they typically spent their first few weeks on the ground, unable to fly. And that strategy worked well in a world with no predators, but in a world with mongooses and cats, the fledglings were acutely vulnerable to being killed. Cats are an additional threat because they also carry and transmit diseases. Toxoplasmosis is a cat-transmitted disease that's of particular concern to people and wildlife. Toxoplasma gondii is a single-celled parasite that reproduces in feline intestines, and it's excreted in the form of oocysts, which are single egg-like cells in cat feces, and it's eventually ingested by an intermediate host like a rat. The parasite settles in the form of cysts in the host's brain, affecting its neural circuitry. So infected rats lose their fear of cats. They're actually even attracted to cat urine. So they become easy prey, and that restarts the parasite cycle again. But the Toxoplasma gondii oocysts are very persistent in the environment, and they can contaminate terrestrial and aquatic environments. Worldwide, toxoplasmosis is one of the most common human parasitic infections. People can become infected by eating contaminated vegetables or uncooked meats, and also by emptying their cat's litter box if they have an outdoor cat, or by weeding a garden that's visited by cats. Growing evidence suggests that the disease might be associated with a variety of mental disorders, including depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and other diseases. And it's also harmed wildlife, killing several alala and at least 14 critically endangered Hawaiian monk seals. Hawaiian birds have also been decimated by introduced mosquitoes. At one time, Hawaii had no biting insects, and it was an absolute avian paradise. But mosquitoes were introduced to the islands in 1826, and they became disease vectors that transmitted avian malaria and avian pox, which are two introduced diseases that were fatal to many of Hawaii's birds. Mosquito transmission of these diseases is why Hawaii is now called the extinction capital of the world. Many of its native birds, especially some of its renowned honey creepers, will die after contracting malaria from a single mosquito bite. Most of the native birds that remain in Hawaii now live at higher elevations where it's cooler and there are fewer mosquitoes. But in our warming climate, mosquitoes can thrive at higher elevations, and soon there's going to be no mosquito-free habitat left for Hawaii's birds. As birds have shown us, introduced organisms, which have especially plagued islands like Hawaii, but have been a scourge the world over, threaten native wildlife, habitats, and humanity. They degrade biodiversity, they cause extinctions, and globally they cost us about $423 billion a year. When I started working on the Hawaiian Crow Recovery Project in the early 1990s, there were only 12 wild alala left. I was tasked with monitoring the very first group of captive reared alala that were reintroduced to the wild. These 5 juvenile crows, 3 females and 2 males, had come from eggs that were laid in the wild, and then they were raised in captivity, and the nestling crows were then transported from the captive breeding facility to the release site and kept in a hack box for several weeks before being released into an attached aviary. After about a month in the aviary, the birds were released to the wild, and I arrived in Hawaii about a week after this release. And this was my first impression upon arriving at the release site. And then through the mist came a strangely, oh no, sorry, I skipped a paragraph. A minute later, we pulled off the road into a clearing that held an aviary so immense, so spectacular, that I simply stared at it, wondering at the work that went into enclosing full-size trees in a fortress that was as impenetrable to outsiders as it had been accommodating to its prior occupants. We stepped out of the vehicle onto the wet grass. And then through the mist came a strangely euphonic medley of throaty, echoing screams, intermixed with rumbled growls and haunting, evocative wails. I felt my neck prickle. The eerie, commanding sound seemed to drift out of the floating fog, seemed to embody the lost voices of the trees, the ferns, the vines, released at last from their cellulose prisons. I was hearing the most prominent and unforgettable voice of the Hawaiian cloud forest, that of the ala, as the Hawaiians dubbed their singular crow. The bird's native name means cry like a child, but the crow's varied, penetrating, ventriloquistic vocalizations could only come from a child of an otherworldly forest, a creature of a more primal time and place. I stood transfixed, irrevocably moved by the strange but captivating sounds which washed over me like a turbulent wind that spoke of an uncertain future, yet felt full of promise. And I thought, 12. Aside from the young reintroduced Hawaiian crows that I was hearing and was about to meet for the first time, only 12 alala remained in the wild. 12 birds to fill these forests with their astonishingly distinctive vocal repertoires. 12 birds to embody the lost world that lingered in this enigmatic place. 12 birds to carry this unique and intriguing species into the future. For a moment, I felt the full weight and the privilege of the task on which I was about to embark. After about a month in the aviary, let's see. Oh wait, hold on, where am I? Okay, sorry. Along with a field partner, I was tasked with tracking the crows through the cloud forest. They were outfitted with tail-mounted radio transmitters, and I also monitored their behavior. In addition, we provided food for the newly released crows, put out water tubs so that they could bathe, and collected fruiting branches for them to feed on. But the crows quickly learned to feed for themselves. Alala eat a wide variety of forest fruits, and they're important seed dispersers. They also feed on insects, which they find under flakes of bark or clusters of leaves, and they probe for nectar in flower blossoms. And this is an adult alala feeding on native fruits. The alala were remarkable. In addition to being very entertainingly vocal, they were funny and playful. They're also incredibly intelligent. They're one of the few birds that can use tools to secure difficult to reach food items, although this behavior has only been documented in captivity. The crows often forage like they're doing in this photo at the tips of trees. They're just incredibly arboreal species. And they sometimes engaged in entertaining foot fights where they grasped each other's feet and pushed and pulled at each other until one of the birds fell off the perch they were on. And I'll just read one more short section that describes an intriguing interaction between two of our male crows, Kehau and Malama. They were brothers. 5 days into my work with the Alala, I set out on a gray morning to follow Kehau and Malama, but I felt under the weather. To my surprise, it quickly became apparent that Malama felt that way too. As the other crows busily hopped along branches, poking their bills under bark and into ohia blossoms, Malama rested, perching quietly and preening sporadically. Fortunately, the other Alala stayed nearby, moving from tree to tree as they foraged. Upon completing yet another behavioral scan, I noted with growing concern that I had recorded Malama sleeping several times, a highly unusual morning behavior. Kehau appeared to be as puzzled as I was by his erstwhile companion's actions. Sidling up to Malama, he made soft mewing calls, then gently preened his sibling's head and neck and delicately nibbled his face. When his ministrations failed to arouse the subdued bird, Kehau plucked an unopened koa flower bud, part of a berry-like cluster that would open into a creamy white powder puff blossom, and pushed it carefully into Malama's back feathers with his bill. No response. Kehau cocked his head, watching Malama, then stretched out his neck, plucked another globular koa bud, and again stashed it with cautious deliberation into Malama's plumage. Still no response. Kehau repeated the process again and again, and still Malama failed to react. Tilting his head, Kehau looked at Malama, murmuring quietly to him. Finally, Malama fluffed out his body feathers and shook them, a comfort behavior known as rousing that often follows a bout of preening, and dislodged the buds, but he remained on his perch, staring at the ground. Malama had in fact contracted avian malaria, but we were able to get him medical help and spend a week treating him for the disease. Perhaps my favorite thing about the alala, though, was the bird's extraordinary voice. The crow has more than 60 different types of calls, and to me, the alala is truly the voice of the Hawaiian cloud forest. Today, though, despite numerous reintroduction and years of efforts, those forests are silent and the crow remains only in captivity. There are no crows currently in the wild. Surprisingly, one of the greatest challenges to the bird's recovery has been that Hawaiian hawks have killed so many reintroduced birds. And although the two species coexisted for eons, the balance between the alala and its native predator has been upended. Plans are now underway for reintroducing alala on the island of Maui, where the EO doesn't occur. And these reintroductions may begin later this year. So heartbreaking as the alala's story is, there's still hope for this captivating bird. And I hope people will read about it and learn more about it and come to care about this unique crow, since the bird's future now depends entirely on us. The California Condor story is much better known, particularly to all of you out in California. Some of you hopefully will be less familiar with the recovery effort in Arizona, so maybe a bit of this will be new to you. This is the third species that I write about in Feather Trails. As you all probably know, the condor is a member of the New World vulture family, and it's the largest terrestrial land bird in North America, with a wingspan of about 9.5 feet. And it's nice to see the contrast with a raven. As you all probably know, oh wait, I just said that, sorry. During the Pleistocene era, more than 10,000 years ago, California condors ranged from British Columbia down to Mexico and as far east as Florida and New York State. Their range contracted with the extinction of the Pleistocene megafauna, which included animals like Columbian mammoths and giant ground sloths. By the 1900s, condors were largely restricted to California, and this was their core range in Southern California until the 1980s. And just to orient you, Monterey is at the top of your slide, and Los Angeles is near the bottom. But scattered reports also exist of condors occurring outside of California until the 1920s. One of the areas where condors also occurred was the Grand Canyon region. Condors were abundant in this area during the Pleistocene, and they also occurred in Arizona in historic times. For example, 2 condors were seen on the western edge of today's Grand Canyon National Park in 1881. And the last sighting of a condor in Arizona was in 1924 in Williams, Arizona, which is just south of the Grand Canyon. Condors declined precipitously during the 1800s and 1900s. Shockingly, when the first successful population census was conducted in 1982, biologists realized that only 22 condors remained, with 21 of these were in the wild and 1 in captivity. The birds had been disappearing for decades, and biologists weren't sure why. Habitat loss and persecution were likely suspects. Many people shot condors, and the birds were also killed indirectly when people put out poison carcasses to kill predators like wolves and coyotes and grizzly bears. But after biologists outfitted some of the few remaining condors with radio transmitters on their wings so that they could track the birds, they discovered several condors that had died of lead poisoning after ingesting ammunition fragments found in the carcasses that they had fed on. When lead bullets hit and enter an animal, they lose about 30% of their mass and fragment into tiny particles, which are then inadvertently consumed by whatever feeds on that animal. It wasn't until years after the first lead poison condor was discovered in 1984 that biologists really began to appreciate the severity of this threat to condors. But meanwhile, in the 1980s, condors were disappearing fast. During the winter of 1984 to 85, 6 of the 15 remaining wild condors disappeared. Following these losses, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decided to capture the last few wild birds to keep them safe and to bolster a new captive breeding program. The last wild condor, known as AC9 for adult condor 9, was captured and brought into captivity in 1987. And this was a controversial and heartbreaking event for many people, since it meant that for the first time in tens of thousands of years, condors no longer flew over North America. Fortunately, though, captive breeding, which was initiated in 1982, was very successful. And the first reintroductions of captive reared condors began in California in 1992. This is a picture of the first 2 birds released. And then in Arizona at the Vermilion Cliffs, which are just north of the Grand Canyon, in 1996. I joined the Condor Recovery Program as the field manager for the Arizona reintroduction effort in 2000. And in addition to releasing condors to the wild, my job along with my field crew was to monitor the birds and keep them safe. This is our pre-release pen where we held condors on top of the Vermilion Cliffs in Arizona. And this is the smaller flight release pen right on the edge of the Vermilion Cliffs. So this is where we released them on release day. Once we released birds to the wild, we taught them how to roost safely to keep them safe from predators at night. And we taught them to stay away from people by hazing them if they perched in inappropriate places. So this picture up in the right-hand corner is an example of a very inappropriate place. Working with condors was a delight. The birds are gregarious, they're intelligent, and they're very, very playful. They're about as close to the Hawaiian crow as any bird I've worked with in terms of their playfulness. So I'll just read 2 quick excerpts that might show you a different side of this enormous vulture than some people expect. In the meantime, though, when transmitter signals indicated that a large group of condors was clustered together, I invariably looked for a carcass or a source of entertainment. After locating 11 condors on the Badger Canyon beach, I quickly surveyed the scene and breathed a sigh of relief when I saw no people, no boats, and no tents. Binoculars glued to my eyes, I sat back to enjoy the show. 2 condors played tug of war with a branch that had washed ashore. Others walked up and down a drift log, jostling for prime positions. Several paddled in an eddy at the river's edge, then sent water flying skyward as they bathed. Suddenly, Condor 196 emerged from a mid-beach condor scrum, holding an irresistible prize aloft in her bill, a plastic 1-gallon jug. She took off at a run, the other condors in hot pursuit, but with a sudden smack, 196 ran face first into a boulder. Momentarily stunned, she sat back on her legs, still holding the jug that had obscured her view. Regaining her balance, 196 scrambled to her feet and ran on as the other condors closed in. Minutes later, 1-year-old Condor 227 commandeered the jug and flung it skyward with his bill. When it landed unexpectedly on his back, 227 leaped in mock fright and turned on his attacker. Seeming captivated by this new twist on the game, 227 again flung the opaque monster skyward, whereupon it fell back down and again landed on his back. Unnoticed on my distant clifftop perch, I laughed out loud, as captivated by the condor's activities as the birds were by their frenzied play. And then I'll just read one more quick excerpt that really highlights the condor's intelligence. The condor's notable but unsung intelligence was underscored for me one evening when biologist Chris Leitner returned to the field house and described Condor 127's solo play with an empty plastic bottle on the Badger Beach. Exhibiting World Cup dexterity, 127 repeatedly punted the bottle down the beach with her bill and chased after it. As she pursued it, the bottle moved closer and closer to the river's edge until the water suddenly caught it and whisked it downstream. In vain, 127 ran along the shoreline, eyes fixed on the bobbing bottle. Just when it seemed lost to her, the current swept the bottle into an eddy several feet from the riverbank. Without hesitation, 127 waded into the water and reached out to retrieve her toy, but it floated just out of reach. Looking around, 127 spotted a partially submerged boulder beyond the bottle. Extending her wings, she hopped out onto the boulder. Now, by stretching her neck, she could just reach the bottle. Nudging it with her beak, she gave it a push shoreward. As it floated toward the beach, she hopped into the water and gave it another nudge, and then another. As the bottle touched solid ground, 127 resumed her frenzied play, punting it down the beach. I know it's anthropomorphizing, Chris remarked, but 127 seemed crushed when she lost her bottle, and she seemed so excited when she was able to retrieve it and could play with it again. As entertained as I was by Chris's story, I was equally struck by 127's intelligence. No level of rote trial by error learning had enabled 127 to retrieve her toy. Instead, she had engaged in multiple steps to exact an outcome that she had envisioned. Figuring out how to reach the bottle, then pushing her prize shoreward and counterintuitively away from her, step by careful step, so she could gain control of it again. On a more somber note, the most critical aspect of my job was keeping condors alive, since they were at constant risk from ingesting lead ammunition in the carcasses that they found. Lead ammunition is the single greatest threat to condors. To be clear, this is not a hunting issue. Hunting is very beneficial for condors since it provides the birds with so many carcasses, but instead it's an ammunition issue. And if it weren't for lead ammunition, condors would be thriving. This is an X-ray of a white-tailed deer killed with a lead core bullet in Wyoming, and the black specks are lead fragments. And the second photo is of a shot coyote, and in this X-ray, the white specks are lead fragments. Birds that fed on carcasses like these were likely to ingest lead. You can see from the scatter that it's almost impossible for them to avoid the lead. If we suspected that condors had fed on a carcass that contained lead ammunition, we recaptured them, tested their blood for lead, and then treated them for lead poisoning if necessary. The treatment is known as chelation therapy, and it involves injecting a condor in its breast muscle twice a day for 5 days with a substance that binds the lead and helps remove it from the body. Even with this treatment, roughly 2/3 of the condors that have died have done so of lead poisoning. In some years, 95% of the condors in Arizona have been exposed to lead, and 70% or so have received chelation. One condor in California had lead poisoning at least 13 times, and that means that it received a minimum of 130 chelation injections. I mean, for each one of those injections, the bird has to be netted and restrained and then given the injection. So it's quite an intensive, stressful process for everybody involved. Other scavengers like bald eagles and ravens are also poisoned when they ingest lead ammunition. In a long-term eagle study in 38 states, nearly half the birds had chronic lead poisoning. More than 1,500 trumpeter and tundra swans died after ingesting lead shot that had accumulated in and around a single lake in the Pacific Northwest. And as many as 15 million mourning doves die each year after ingesting lead shot that's sprayed over fields by dove hunters. So what about people who eat hunter-killed game meat? Are they vulnerable too? To investigate this, a North Dakota doctor x-rayed 100 packages of venison that had been donated to food banks by local hunters in 2007. 59% of the packages that he x-rayed contained visible lead fragments, and this is a photo of one of those packages. And all of the little white fragments are little bits of lead. After these findings were publicized, other states x-rayed their venison donations, the ones that had been donated to food banks, and they also found alarming lead levels. Despite these findings years ago, food bank donations of hunter-killed meat are still unregulated, and donor organizations don't require their hunters to use non-lead ammunition. So we worry about lead in our pipes and in our children's toys, and yet every year hunters are donating millions of pounds of game meat shot with lead to the needy, or eating such meat themselves, thinking that they're doing something healthy for their families. This kind of lead consumption may be having profoundly negative health and societal outcomes. Scores of medical doctors, public health experts, and scientists have highlighted the human health threat posed by lead ammunition and called for the use of safer types of ammunition for hunting. Non-lead bullets that don't fragment are now widely available. No level of lead is considered safe for people, and the toxic lead effects are largely irreversible. Meanwhile, hunter advocacy groups like the NRA say there's no cause for concern. We've been hunting with lead bullets for years and no one's the worse for it. Yet the effects of lead can be subtle and they're often attributed to other causes. For example, in adults, chronic lead effects can include high blood pressure, decreased kidney function, and reproductive issues such as impotence, decreased fertility, and miscarriages. Lead exposure can cause digestive issues and muscle and joint pain, and it may be related to cognitive decline and dementia in older adults. It also affects longevity. Adults with higher lead levels are more likely to die of cancer and have an increased risk of death from strokes and heart attacks. In children, lead can lower IQ levels, lead to learning disabilities, and impair physical and intellectual development. Lead-exposed children have poor reading abilities, lower test scores, and a higher frequency of delinquent, antisocial, and aggressive behavior. Lead exposure has also been linked to criminality. Studies suggest that the widespread declines of violent crime in the 1990s followed the phasing out of leaded gasoline in the late 1970s and early 1980s. But we still have no idea if and how ingesting lead ammunition might be contributing to violence and crime today. We're very good at ignoring the warning signs that things in our environment are dangerous. We've known that lead bullet fragments are poisoning California condors since the 1980s, and it's hard to imagine ignoring a bigger sodier canary in the coal mine than the California condor, but that's exactly what we've been doing. Things are starting to change. For the sake of condors, as I'm sure you're all aware, California banned the use of lead ammunition starting in 2019, which is amazing. So thank you, California, for always paving the way for the rest of the country. But it's strange that we rarely hear about the human health impacts of lead ammunition, and most states aren't even discussing the problem. Despite the perils of lead, there are many high points during my work with condors. In 2001, I was fortunate to document the first egg laid in the wild by reintroduced condors. News of Condor 119's famous egg was broadcast all over the country, and Discover magazine included this event in their list of the top 100 science stories of 2001. I also had the good fortune of monitoring Arizona's first ever condor chick. Condor 305 had the chance to be the first nestling raised by reintroduced condors to fledge in the wild. And I won't spoil the book by letting you know if this historic fledging occurred, but I will say that it was an incredible roller coaster getting to this point in Arizona, and events were even more challenging and dramatic in California. Oops. Despite the existential threat that lead ammunition poses to condors, reintroductions and intensive management have significantly bolstered the condor population since its low point of 22 birds. Condors are now successfully reproducing in the wild, and condors are reclaiming more and more of their former range. Thanks to the Endangered Species Act and thousands of dedicated people, these three incredible species are still with us today. The peregrine falcon is one of our biggest conservation success stories. It taught us that the best way to recover a species is to eliminate its main threat. In the case of peregrines, that was the pesticide DDT. Not eliminating the main threat to a species undermines its recovery, as we're seeing with the California condor. But if we can eliminate lead ammunition, then we'll be successful at saving condors too. The Hawaiian crow faces multiple complex threats, which inevitably makes its recovery more challenging. In addition, funding and recovery efforts were inadequate for many decades until it was almost too late. Hawaiian birds, which are some of our most endangered birds, are still underfunded compared to mainland species. But the peregrine and other recovered birds really have shown us that conservation efforts do work. Oops, where's this? There we go. These are some of the other birds I've worked with in addition to these. In addition to supporting these and other conservation efforts, all of us can help birds in dozens of small ways during our daily lives. We can keep our cats indoors, we can put decals on our windows to prevent bird collisions, avoid using pesticides around our homes, grow native plants, use non-lead ammunition, support our public lands, and take a host of other small steps that benefit birds. And by doing so, we not only enrich our own lives by supporting the bird life around us, but we're also likely to save a host of other creatures that share the planet with us, including maybe ourselves. So Feather Trails just came out on May 2nd, and it's now available in bookstores and online in hardback, Kindle, and audiobook versions. And I'm happy to answer any questions people might have. That was a lot of information thrown at you all at once.
That was wonderful, Sophie. Great presentation and great work that you've done. There are a couple questions in chat, but I'm going to hold off on those for a moment because I've got a couple of questions myself, and maybe people would like to take this time to enter any questions that they might have for Sophie. I guess you may have answered this already, but I'm wondering if you think when we banned DDT, and when legislation in California came out preventing the use of lead shot, I'm wondering if there's any other legislation you think would be helpful for birds, perhaps with relationship to the nicotinoids.
Yes, I think there's some legislation about neonicotinoids in the works, but in individual towns and states. So there's still, as far as I know, are no sort of federal regulations about neonicotinoids. The US EPA has been sort of investigating the impacts for particular neonicotinoid pesticides for years. Like they were saying in 2016 they would do these studies and determine whether they wanted to restrict their usage. But then those studies got punted to 2020 and now they're 2024. So they're still studying and still looking at the impacts of those. So far on a federal level, there haven't been regulations for neonicotinoids, but Several towns have actually banned them. I think Eugene, Oregon was the first town to ban the use of neonicotinoids. I think Seattle and Portland followed suit, and we're finally starting to see some movement in individual states. Surprisingly, I think there's 3 states, I'm not going to remember which 3, but Nevada is one of them that surprised me. It has some of the strictest regulations for neonicotinoids. And most of those right now are banning their use for landscaping usage and sort of smaller scale usage. There's still, as far as I know, not a lot of regulations on their uses on crops. And I just, hopefully people will keep advocating for restricting their use, because it's one of the neonicotinoids is, people think, one of the reasons our bee colonies have been declining, and we're just having, insect issues worldwide.
Well, wonderful. Yeah. So that does sound like reason for hope. The fact that some states have made some movement in that direction.
And Vermont's working on it right now. It was sort of too bad they had some legislation where they were hoping to ban some neonicotinoid use, and I think it passed in the legislatures, but their governor just vetoed it, which was super unfortunate. So it's slow, far too slow, but it is starting to happen, and I think it is increasingly getting more attention. When I first started writing about the peregrine section of this book, almost no one had heard of neonicotinoids, and in the time it took me to complete this book, it's been encouraging to see that it is something that people are talking about and working toward dealing with now.
So here are a couple questions. One's from Howard. Were Alala historically on all Hawaiian islands? And if so, do the new West Maui release locations have appropriate environmental dietary resources to sustain a population?
That's a great question. They only ever occurred on Hawaii. There's no records of them occurring in other places. There may be a few fossil records of them occurring on Maui, if I'm remembering correctly, but there's no, they only occurred on Hawaii in historic records. I think there are suitable food resources on Maui. But it is an interesting strategy to release them on an island where they haven't been native in historic times. But I think what they're hoping is that if they can reintroduce alala without the pressure of the Hawaiian hawks and get them at least breeding in the wild, because so far they hadn't actually reproduced in the wild. They'd built nests, but they hadn't actually raised young. So I think they're really hoping that they can get some birds to get as far as that without the pressure of the EOs on them. So there seems to be appropriate habitat and food resources on Maui.
Good. Well, that leads nicely into this question from Bob. If the Alala, a corvid and not a pure vegetarian, is there a risk that the introduction to Maui could put their endemics at risk, the Maui endemics?
I don't think they would necessarily be put at risk, but it's definitely, I mean, to me, it's definitely a concern. And I have not read all of the arguments and all of the justifications and the environmental impact statements for the reintroduction on Maui yet. I've just been following it sort of as a layperson in the news, but it's definite concern. The alala are really, frugivorous, and they also eat insects, but they will eat nestling birds. They're opportunistic, and so it's certainly, they could target some of Hawaii's native birds. But I think they'll probably be more at the lower elevations where there's a lot of non-natives in Hawaii. So I imagine they would probably be more heavily impacted than the native honey creepers.
Yeah, there certainly are a lot of non-natives there. A lot of questions about the Alala. So here's one from Chris.
Good.
This is really interesting, he says. Thank you. You mentioned that the Alala will be reintroduced from captivity to the wild later this year. Do you know if the main predator, the Hawaiian hawk, population has changed over time? I think you started to answer that. Perhaps you already did, about the Hawaiian hawk and any changes it might have undergone.
I have not tracked the Hawaiian hawk closely. However, when I was working on the alala in the early 1990s, the Hawaiian hawk was considered endangered. Um, they seem to have, I think, I don't know if they are still considered threatened or if they are stable now, but their populations definitely increased, and they had a much better time sort of adapting and capitalizing on the changes in habitats that have harmed the alala. So in the Alala's forest, one of the problems that I didn't talk about was feral pigs have been introduced, and feral pigs have really decimated, as have introduced cattle, decimated the understory of the Alala's forests. And that's bad for Alala because they've lost a lot of cover, whereas the Hawaiian hawks were able to sort of capitalize on that more open habitat. And
Mm.
they also are subsidized by the introduced rats. And so they will feed on rats as well as feeding on birds. So there's a lot of things that have actually benefited the EO, and they've managed to increase their population, whereas the Alala have had a harder time of things. And I think, their numbers have decreased so much, they've just been increasingly vulnerable to EO attacks.
Huh, interesting. That does make sense about the pigs and pulling away the undergrowth, I imagine.
Hmm.
Uh,
And
so,
that's one of the main problems with mosquitoes too that I didn't get into because there's so much and it's complicated, but it is all in my book. But the feral pigs make wallows and dig out ground where water collects, and that increases the mosquito breeding habitat. So, there wasn't a lot of natural mosquito breeding habitat in some of these forests, but the feral pigs have increased that habitat.
here's a question about the condors. How do you know which condors were likely to have ingested lead?
We had to just monitor them really closely, and we had to determine just basically where they were feeding, and we would track them and watch them and see them feeding on something. So if we saw that they had fed on a shot coyote, we had a pretty good idea that they probably ingested lead. Almost always, if we found them feeding on a coyote, we would try to retrap those birds and test their blood. Sometimes they would be feeding in the forest, and it was clearly a road-killed elk or a cow that had died in the forest, a free-range cattle. So then we knew that it was probably okay. And then it dependent on where they were feeding. So a lot of times we would just have their signals out in Grand Canyon National Park, and they were in the park, and all their signals were in one area, so they were clearly feeding, but we knew that that was probably a safe carcass. So it was mainly just by monitoring them and tracking their signals and trying to get a visual on as many carcasses as we possibly could.
Yeah. So here's a message from Nicole, who's giving a shout out to John Hamber, who's one of the, uh,
Yes,
yeah, who.
Dan's a dear friend.
Oh, good, good.
So
And
I thank
also,
her in my acknowledgments.
I think you might have mentioned Mandia Ray, uh, maybe not,
No, I haven't.
who was the first who suggested releasing condors in Arizona. Also,
I did yes, I did mention him in my first book, Condors in Canyon Country. Yes, he was the
Amadeo, I
it
think.
was great.
Yeah, good. And also a recommendation to see Anthony Prieto's documentary, The Non-Lead Hunter, on Vimeo.
Yes. Yes, he has done some great work with raising, attention about gut piles and how important it is to use non-lead ammunition. I'm so grateful to California because, it's all so way ahead of where the rest of the country is with a lot of these environmental issues. And we were really constrained in Arizona, unfortunately, because condors were introduced as a non-essential experimental population, which means that we couldn't legislate things for them as though they were an endangered species. And so you can't ban lead for condors in Arizona, but it was great that you could do that in California. So it will be really interesting to see over time how the birds manage with lead in California compared to Arizona. Unfortunately, it doesn't take much. One poached carcass can really impact a lot of birds.
Well, it's so exciting to see condors venturing northward into well within our county and
It's
beyond our county.
exciting.
It's very exciting.
Yeah.
Love every opportunity to see them, and it's a lot closer than pinnacles.
Right. It's fantastic that they're just reclaiming more and more of their former range. It's really exciting to see them expanding.
Did they do just release some in Oregon or planning to release some in Oregon?
I think it's in northern, it's really right on the border in northern California. And so I think that that's going to be amazing because in the next few years, they're going to be up in Oregon as well.
Well,
So
they're
that,
already getting them in Humboldt County.
oh, that's amazing. Yeah.
Up there that are being reported. Um, so I was struck by the National Geographic cover with the insects, and it said you'll miss them when they're gone, and that reminded me so much of we had Doug Talamy talk to us about
Oh,
a year
nice.
ago, and
Wow.
he spoke a lot about neonicotinoids, which was fascinating. So yeah, it's so true, and I think we're doing everything we can to promote natives and get people
Good.
to encourage pollinators. We talk less about pesticides, but we do recommend against plants with neonicotinoids. Certain certain nurseries are better for that than others.
Right. Exactly. And I have a lot of that sort of information in my books. I mean, for a lot of years, I would try to plant a pollinator garden, not really realizing that some of the nurseries, they had plants that they're raised from seeds that were coated with neonicotinoids. So I might have been doing more harm to my pollinators than I was helping. And I didn't realize it at that point. But I think, there is a greater awareness of it, and knowledge that these problems are out there is a huge part of the battle. And then comes us trying to advocate to sort of restrict and regulate these pesticides. But I think it's great that there are a lot of people increasingly getting the word out about them.
Yeah, for sure. So there are more comments streaming in. This is from Linda. S269, Protect America's Children from Toxic Pesticides Act, was introduced by the Senate by Cory Booker in 2023. It removes dangerous pesticides from use, including neonics. It's stalled in an agriculture committee. Even the threat to children's health didn't encourage actions on the issue. So true. And Ina says, how can we, as individuals, push against the use of neonicotinoids?
I think, if there are things, bills that come up in your legislature that have to do with neonicotinoids, just, calling your legislators and getting on board in that way. I think putting the word out there whenever you can, talking to your friends, mentioning it, just making it part of conversations. When you go to buy plants at a nursery, ask them if they use neonicotinoids. I mean, I just think sort of gently pushing on all these different places where you might get them. If you go to Ace Hardware to buy some lawn seed or something, ask them if they have neonicotinoids. I mean, they're really pervasive. That was something, I had this, just tiny little patch of lawn around my house some years ago, when I had just moved to a new place, and I bought some lawn seed, and it was painted blue, or it was dyed blue. And I thought, well, that's good. I'll be able to see where I'm sowing it. And I didn't think it was that big a deal. But later I found out that coating was neonicotinoids. So, be just aware of when you buy things like lawn seed or you buy your plants, just to ask about those things. And I think just that's at least a first place to start, and then following what might be happening in your town or in your state legislature, because there are some bills that are coming up, and these things are starting to get more attention. And the more support we can give those types of things, the better.
Yeah, and it's a really good advice to, select your nursery or your garden store very carefully. And the more
Mhm.
questions we ask about these issues, the more they will have to learn about them if they're not already aware.
Exactly. And if people keep asking about them and say, oh gosh, well, I don't want to buy those because,
Yeah.
I'm trying to help pollinators, if enough people start saying that, that will encourage them to, get their plants from a different source that don't use neonicotinoid coated seeds.
Yeah, it becomes a market issue, and
Mhm.
that's always going to help people.
Yeah.
So two people, Maureen and Nicole, pointed out that the Yurok tribe were the group releasing the condors in Humboldt. So I assume that's on sacred land. So those are probably the ones that are showing up in Humboldt Bay right now.
Exactly. And they're the ones that, I'm hoping will go up into Oregon and get closer to that sort of British Columbia extension on their range. So it's exciting.
Yeah. There's a couple more questions, comments. Are nurseries required to post if their plants have been treated? I imagine that comes on the packaging, but
See, and that's fantastic. And that's where, things are very different in California than in Montana and some of our, redder states. So I think that the more you all are doing in California, the more that will rub off on some of the other states. So I'm always grateful.
and there's a shout out from Nicole to support the Californians for Pesticide Reform and Pesticide Action Network. Sounds like a good thing to look up.
Definitely.
So yeah, I've got several people just thanking you for the wonderful presentation, and
Oh, thank you.
very exciting to hear that your book and your work. And I guess I have one more question, and that is, are there other species that you plan to work with this way in the future?
I would love to. I don't know that it will happen. I've been out into the field for a little while now, so I'm not sure if I'll have those kind of opportunities again. I really, in some ways, just sort of fell into these opportunities, and it was just an incredible sort of life enriching experience. I really hope to, and I'd really like to do more work with tropical birds too. Have become a big passion. So, but right now I've just been more using words to try to help birds as opposed to actually doing the work in the field.
Well, you're definitely the person to do that. And if you produce more work like this, I'm sure everybody will be happy. So
I hope so. And there are a lot, I focused a lot on some of the more serious elements of this book, but there are a lot of stories, and it really just, gives you a feel for what it's like to be out with these incredible birds. When there are so few birds left in the wild, you get to know individuals really well, and they all have personalities. They're all very different. And so it just makes for an incredibly entertaining experience working with them.
yeah, and one last comment. Ina or Ina, I'm not sure, wants to thank you, and I'm sure she speaks for everybody here, wants to thank you for the amazing hard work you've done, and she's so grateful,
Thank you.
as I'm sure we all are. I'm going to let you go now, and I want to thank you so much for being here and sharing your stories and sharing your work.
Thank you.
Look forward to hearing more from you in the future. And this recording will be available tomorrow on our website. I'll send you a link so you'll be able to take a look at it whenever you'd like. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being part of the speaker series. You can go to bed now in Montana. Later there.
Yes, forgive my stumbles. It's quite late for me, and I'm not a night person anymore, but I am so grateful that so many of you came out to listen to me talk and hear about these wonderful birds. So thanks to all of you for caring.
Good night, everyone. Good night, Sophie.
Good night.